I am Katherine Sullivan, 34, a public high school teacher who grades essays at a wobbling thrift store desk. I have learned to stretch a paycheck the way some people stretch the truth. When my grandmother's will was read, I sat in a paneled room that smelled of lemon polish. The attorney lifted a folder and announced that the entire estate, valued at $62 million, had been left to me alone. Chairs scraped, my father's jaw locked. My mother touched her bracelet, my brother's knee bounced. They spoke of fairness and demanded that I hand control to them. I kept my hands folded and answered with one word that felt like a door closing: no. The attorney said my grandmother had documented her wishes and been of sound mind. In the quiet, I heard her voice telling me to hold my line with courtesy and steel. By afternoon, I stood in the hallway of my apartment with a canvas bag and a notice. My parents said the unit belonged to a family company and that my access had expired. I wrapped a photo of my grandmother in a scarf and tucked it between 2 blouses and a pair of shoes. The frame clicked against the zipper like a heartbeat. My father watched the clock. My mother urged me to be reasonable. My brother smiled at the floor. The air tasted metallic. The lock turned with the confidence of steel. I walked down the stairs with the bag cutting into my shoulder and the notice folded like a verdict. Morning brought tires on gravel and a van with a ladder rack. A locksmith stepped out holding a toolbox. My parents moved up the front steps with the bored authority of people who have always gotten their way. My brother raised his phone to collect proof for an audience I could not see. They had returned to finish an eviction at the house my grandmother loved. They believed presence was 9/10 of ownership and that intimidation was the rest. They expected me to stand alone. When they reached the porch and saw who stood beside me, their steps shortened and their faces stilled. I was not alone. A retired judge with winter white hair rested a hand on the rail. Our attorney held a sealed envelope and a small flash drive. The caretaker folded his arms and watched the gate. A neighbor who had known me since childhood set a stack of journals on the bench. The locksmith studied his shoes. My father looked from the judge to the envelope. My mother's hand hovered over the brass knob. My brother lowered his phone by inches. The porch smelled of cut grass and cold metal. A mourning dove called from the hedges as if announcing the hour. In the conference room, the attorney had not only recited numbers, he had read intent. My grandmother kept lists, she kept ledgers, she kept the names of those who showed up with casseroles and those who arrived with calculators. She trusted me, not because I was perfect, but because she had watched me carry debts that were not mine. She saw how I taught teenagers to read fine print before signing anything. She watched me stand up quietly when quiet was mistaken for consent. She left allies and documents. She left a boundary that looked, at last, like safety. My mother tried to recast events as a misunderstanding. She pressed 2 fingers to her temple and spoke about reputation. My father said real assets belonged in experienced hands and lifted a pen as if the problem were a missing signature. The judge cleared his throat with the calm of a man who had sworn oaths. The caretaker tapped a phone that held security footage. The attorney kept his thumb on the envelope like a seal on a gate. I set my bag by my feet and felt the center of the porch hold. Noise would not run this house, intention would. This is how the story begins, not with a scream, but with a ledger, a key, and a word spoken. They saw a number to divide. I saw a legacy to defend. My parents did not know my grandmother had planned for this day. When I look back on my childhood, I can almost chart the years by the small betrayals that shaped me. I was 9 when I first learned what it meant to have my savings taken. I had been tucking away birthday money and coins earned from helping neighbors rake leaves. The jar sat hidden behind a stack of old storybooks in my closet, but one morning it was gone. At dinner, my father announced that he had borrowed it to cover a utility bill. He never put it back. I remember staring at the mashed potatoes on my plate, tasting salt from my tears rather than from the food. That was the first time I understood how powerless a child could feel when trust was traded for convenience. Years later, when college applications filled the mailbox, my mother slid a packet of loan documents across the kitchen table. She told me to sign them without reading too much. "This is the only way you'll get into school," she said, her voice sharp and efficient. The numbers blurred on the page, yet she pressed my hand with the pen until my name appeared in ink. Those loans carried my signature, not theirs, and I bore the weight of repayment long after. What stung most was not the debt itself, but the certainty that my parents saw me as a tool for leverage, not a daughter worth protecting. Ethan, my younger brother, never signed a thing. He was shielded from responsibility, wrapped in indulgence, praised for achievements he had not yet earned. If I brought home a solid grade, my father shrugged and said Ethan would go further. When Ethan stumbled, my mother bent rules to keep his path smooth. One evening, I overheard her murmur, "Katherine is a burden, Ethan is our hope." Those words burned deeper than any unpaid bill. They told me exactly where I stood in their hierarchy. I was the insurance policy, the sacrifice, the one expected to absorb blows so Ethan could shine. In that landscape of scarcity and favoritism, my grandmother emerged like a lantern in fog. She lived in a modest brick house with windows that always smelled faintly of cinnamon. Welcomed me after school with a smile that did not measure my worth against anyone else. In her kitchen, she taught me how to peel apples without breaking the spiral, how to stir butter and sugar until they turned into caramel warmth. Her apple pies cooled on the windowsill, and with each slice, she reminded me that dignity was worth more than coins in a jar. On winter evenings, she spread fabric across her lap and showed me how to knit squares for a quilt. My stitches were clumsy at first, but she never scolded me. Instead, she said, "Each mistake is just a new pattern." She told stories of her own youth, how she had faced loss and learned that money could build a house, but never a home. "Character, Katherine," she whispered, "is the only inheritance you can never lose." Her words stitched into me more tightly than any blanket. While my parents tightened their grip on every dollar I tried to earn, my grandmother gave me something they could never control, a sense of self. In her presence, I was not a liability or a placeholder for someone else's dreams. I was simply her granddaughter, capable of learning, worthy of care, trusted with truth. She filled the hollow spaces left by neglect with lessons that would one day become my compass. Even as a child, I sensed the contrast. In one house, I was drained by demands. In the other, I was nourished by trust. My grandmother's kitchen smelled of apples and hope. My parents' kitchen reeked of resentment and fear. That contrast formed the backbone of who I would become, a woman who knew the cost of financial betrayal, but also the value of integrity. I see now that she was preparing me for the battles ahead. Her pies, her quilts, her stories were not just comforts. They were armor disguised as tenderness. She showed me that resilience could be baked, sown, and spoken into existence. Long before lawyers or inheritance, she planted the belief that I could endure. By the time I reached adulthood, I had carved out a modest life for myself, though it often felt like walking a tightrope with no net. I became a high school English teacher, pouring long hours into lesson plans and grading essays under dim apartment light. Teaching did not make me wealthy, but it gave me purpose. Every time I saw a shy student gain confidence through words, I felt a flicker of victory. Still, outside the classroom, my own life was a constant negotiation with scarcity and control. I lived in a small, one-bedroom apartment that technically belonged to my parents. They called it helping me out by renting it to me at a reduced rate, but the truth was that the lease was never in my name. Every month I handed them rent in cash, and every month my mother reminded me how fortunate I was. "Without us, you'd be on the street," she liked to say. The walls of that apartment carried more than just my framed posters and thrift store furniture. They carried the weight of knowing that my home could be taken from me at any time without warning. Control was their language. When Ethan's car broke down, my father called me during lunch duty and said, "You'll cover the repair bill. It's family responsibility." I stared at the phone, my sandwich untouched, students buzzing around me, and felt the familiar pull of duty mixed with anger. My paycheck barely covered rent, utilities, and groceries, yet somehow I was always expected to patch the holes Ethan created. When I pushed back, my father's tone turned icy. "Do you want your students to think you can't even care for your own family?" The guilt pressed down until I agreed. Life was measured in coins and small sacrifices. I clipped coupons, stretched meals into 3 nights, and bought bruised fruit from the discount bin. Each week I made lists, calculating every cent before stepping into the grocery store. I learned which cashier looked the other way when I used a manufacturer's coupon twice. My freezer often held only bags of frozen peas and discounted chicken, but I told myself it was enough. On Fridays, while other teachers ordered takeout, I ate peanut butter sandwiches at my desk, convincing myself it tasted fine. The indignities were relentless, disguised as obligations. When I fell behind on what my parents called the family communication fee, a contribution they demanded to keep me connected, my mother cut off my phone plan without warning. One moment I was texting a colleague about a lesson plan. The next, my screen went dark, service suspended. Her message arrived later in my email. Pay your share or stop expecting luxuries. A phone was not a luxury, not when you relied on it to reach students, but she made it clear that independence came at a price she controlled. I remember nights sitting at the small kitchen table, a single lamp casting shadows across unpaid bills. The radiator hissed with uneven heat, and I wrapped myself in the quilt my grandmother had once helped me sew. That quilt was more than warmth. It was a reminder that someone had once seen me as worthy of care. My parents reduced every interaction to transactions, but my grandmother's memory whispered that dignity was not for sale. Despite the weight, I refused to collapse. I carried my tiredness into the classroom, but refused to let my students see defeat. Their laughter and their essays filled the hollow places, and when they thanked me for helping them find their voice, I held on tighter to my own. Teaching gave me a steady rhythm, a reason to endure the financial leash my parents kept around my neck. At times I wondered if this was all my life would be, a careful balancing act of serving others, scraping by, and bracing for the next demand from my parents. Yet beneath the exhaustion, a quiet ember of defiance glowed. I began to set aside tiny amounts of money, a secret envelope tucked inside a book of poetry. It was not much, but it was mine, untouched by their hands. Every dollar slipped. Inside felt like a declaration, a reminder that I was not entirely theirs to control. Living this way hardened me, yes, but it also sharpened me. Each injustice etched lessons into my bones. Each humiliation taught me to wait, to watch, to endure, without showing my cards. I became practiced at silence, skilled at hiding anger behind calm. And though I often walked home with weary steps and an empty wallet, I carried the stubborn knowledge that one day I would break free. The day of my grandmother's funeral arrived draped in heavy gray clouds that seemed to press down on everyone's shoulders. The church smelled faintly of lilies, though the scent could not disguise the tension simmering beneath whispered condolences. I stood by the casket, my black dress too loose from weeks of stress, while neighbors offered polite words. My parents, Gregory and Linda, did not linger near the flowers or mourners. Instead, I caught them huddled together in the corner pew, their voices low but unmistakable. "Where is her money?" $62 million does not simply vanish, my father muttered. My mother's reply was sharper. It had better not all be locked away. We deserve our share. Their fixation on inheritance cast a shadow darker than the storm outside. Ethan slouched in the row behind them, tapping on his phone, until Linda leaned over and whispered, "Pay attention. This is important." For them, grief was a formality. For me, it was raw, a wound reopened with every hymn. My grandmother had been the only consistent source of warmth in my life, and now she was gone, leaving silence where her laughter once lived. After the burial, we were summoned to the office of Alan Price, my grandmother's lawyer. His building was stately, with dark wood paneling and shelves lined with law books that smelled faintly of dust. I sat at the long, polished table, my hands trembling under the surface, while my parents perched upright like vultures. Ethan leaned back in his chair, eyes gleaming with anticipation. Alan adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat, his tone grave but steady. "By the wishes of your grandmother, Margaret Hayes," he began, Her estate is to be transferred in full to her granddaughter, Katherine Sullivan. For a moment, silence swallowed the room. My breath caught in my chest, the words not fully sinking in. Then came the eruption. Ethan slammed his fists onto the table. "That's impossible. I'm her grandson, too. Why should she get everything?" His face flushed red as he pointed at me as though I had stolen something. Linda's voice followed, laced with venom. "Katherine, what could you possibly know about handling $62 million? You scrape by on a teacher's salary. This is absurd." Her laugh was brittle, mocking, each word an attempt to shrink me back into the dependent child she had always wanted me to be. Gregory's silence was more dangerous than their noise. He narrowed his eyes at Alan, demanding, "Is this legal?" "We will contest it. She cannot be allowed to squander what we built as a family." His words dripped with entitlement, as though the fortune had been his to begin with. Alan remained calm. "Your mother was very clear. She left detailed instructions." He pressed a button on a small remote, and suddenly the lights dimmed slightly as a screen lowered from the wall. A video flickered to life. My grandmother appeared, sitting in her familiar armchair, a quilt folded neatly across her lap. The sight of her face, the softness in her eyes, stole my breath. Her voice filled the room, steady and deliberate. "Gregory, Linda," she began, addressing my parents by name. "You chose to abandon Katherine when she needed you most. You placed burdens on her that were never hers to carry, while Ethan was shielded from accountability. You treated her as a liability instead of a blessing." My parents stiffened, their faces blanching as her words cut deeper than any blade. She turned her gaze slightly toward the camera, as though looking right at me. "Katherine, you have shown resilience, honesty, and compassion, even when the world demanded bitterness. I leave everything to you, not because of wealth, but because you embody the values I hold most dear. Remember, money is a tool, character is a legacy. Do not let them take that from you." Tears welled in my eyes as the screen went black. For the first time, the power dynamic had shifted. My parents' outrage was no longer just about money. It was about being exposed. The woman they dismissed as frail had orchestrated justice with one final act. The silence afterward was deafening. Ethan looked stricken, his bravado shattered. Linda's lips pressed into a thin, trembling line. Gregory glared at me with eyes cold as stone, as though I were the executioner of their pride. In that moment, I felt both terrified and liberated. My grandmother had not only given me her fortune, she had given me her voice, recorded for the world to hear. And with that voice, she had drawn a line in the sand that my parents could no longer pretend did not exist. The silence in Alan Price's office lingered after the screen went dark, as though my grandmother's presence still hovered in the air. I could feel her strength, but before I could steady myself, the weight of my parents' fury crashed down. Linda leaned across the polished table, her nails tapping like claws. "This can be settled now, Katherine. Divide the estate equally, or consider yourself no daughter of ours." Her tone was sharp, rehearsed, as if she had been waiting years to deliver that threat. Gregory's voice followed, colder and more final. "Your choice will decide whether you remain part of this family. Give Ethan and us what is rightfully ours, or walk out of here a stranger." His eyes locked onto mine, not with grief, not even with disappointment, but with the calculating chill of a man who saw me as a pawn, standing in the wrong square. Ethan, flushed with frustration, slammed his palm against the table. "She does not deserve all of it. I have plans. I have needs. Dad, tell her she cannot just keep everything. She is selfish." His anger felt rehearsed too, like a script they had handed him in the car before we arrived. For a long moment, I did not answer. My lips pressed into a thin line, my chest rising and falling as I tried to breathe against the crushing weight of their ultimatum. I had known their greed for years, but hearing it crystallized into such blunt rejection carved deeper wounds than I expected. Their love, conditional and brittle, dangled before me like bait. They wanted me to trade my dignity for a seat at their table, and the offer stung because I still carried the remnants of a child's desire to belong. The room seemed to shrink as their voices pressed in. Linda's words cut sharper. "We raised you. We sacrificed for you. Without us, you are nothing. You think that money will make you whole? You will come crawling back when the world teaches you how little you know." Gregory folded his arms, waiting for me to break. Every memory of their neglect flickered through me, the jar of coins they had stolen, the loans they had forced me to sign, the endless comparisons to Ethan. Each betrayal resurfaced, layering one atop another until I could barely hold the weight. I wanted to scream, to remind them of every cruelty, but instead I sat still, my silence speaking louder than any outburst could. Alan's gaze found mine in the chaos. He did not raise his voice. Instead, he reached across the table, resting his hand lightly on my shoulder. His gesture was quiet, almost invisible to my parents, but it anchored me. "Your grandmother knew this moment would come," he whispered, his words low and deliberate. "She prepared for it. Trust what she left you." That sentence struck deeper than the threats hurled at me. My grandmother had anticipated the storm I now faced. She had foreseen their demand, their conditional love, their willingness to sever ties over money, and she had trusted me with the strength to endure it. Alan's reassurance gave me something my parents never had, the reminder that I was not standing alone. I looked at them, my so-called family, and saw not parents but strangers who had long since traded affection for entitlement. I saw Ethan's desperation not as brotherly rivalry, but as a reflection of years he had been shielded from accountability. The clarity was painful, but also liberating. The choice they presented was no choice at all. To give in would mean erasing everything my grandmother had instilled in me. To refuse meant carrying the weight of their rejection, but it also meant carrying her legacy intact. My silence stretched into the room, and in it, their faces hardened, expecting me to cave. But I did not. What I felt was not triumph, but grief layered upon grief. The loss of my grandmother intertwined with the realization that my parents had finally voiced what their actions had long proven. I was only valuable to them as a source of wealth, and now that I refused, I was nothing at all in their eyes. Alan's hand remained steady on my shoulder, and I drew strength from the quiet conviction he offered. I knew this battle was far from over. My parents would not walk away quietly, but in that moment I chose silence over surrender, pain over betrayal, dignity over desperation. My mother called before sunset and invited me to talk things through at my apartment. She said we should meet in private and find a path that honored everyone. I wanted to believe her, so I walked home with a careful hope in my chest. They were already there. My father stood by the window with his phone in his hand. My mother sat at the table with a notepad. Ethan leaned against the counter with a smirk that made my stomach tighten. My mother said a family arrangement was still possible if I cooperated. My father added that chaos could be avoided if I signed an agreement to let them manage everything. He glanced toward the hall. The door opened. A man in a polo shirt stepped in with a clipboard. He introduced himself as the property manager and handed me a notice in bold type. The heading read, "Termination of occupancy." The paragraph below said my access to the premises was revoked effective immediately. I asked who owned the company. My mother answered calmly. She said the building belonged to a holding company, the holding company belonged to a trust, and the trust served our family. In practice, that meant them. I asked how long I had. My father checked his watch and said I had 30 minutes to pack essentials and leave the keys on the counter. Ethan took a drink and said, "Consequences build character." He added, "62 million will not keep you warm tonight." The minutes narrowed to a tunnel. I pulled my small suitcase from under the bed. I opened drawers with quick hands and stacked clothes in tight rolls. 2 pairs of jeans, 3 shirts, 2 sweaters. I wrapped my grandmother's photo in a scarf and slid it between the layers. The zipper caught, then eased. In the bathroom, I swept a toothbrush, a comb, and a small bottle of aspirin into a pouch. Every sound seemed too loud. The hallway smelled like dust and lemons as the minutes slipped away. My father stood in the doorway like a sentry. When I reached for the desk where I kept lesson plans, he shuffled the folders before handing them over. My mother called a realtor and switched to her professional voice. She described square footage and natural light, then asked what the market would pay for a fast turnover. Ethan opened cabinets he had never helped me stock and laughed at a chipped mug. I checked the clock on the stove. 15 minutes. I pulled my coat from the hook and slid my feet into worn shoes. The apartment felt smaller than it had in the morning. In the kitchen drawer, I found an envelope of emergency cash I had hidden behind a torn cookbook. I slipped it into my pocket and closed the drawer. My phone buzzed with a message from a student who wanted feedback on a paragraph about resilience. I typed a sentence of encouragement and hit send. 10 minutes. I unplugged the bedside lamp my grandmother had given me and traced the chip on its base. My father cleared his throat and said time. I nodded. I had forgotten the plant by the window, a stubborn fern that kept forgiving me. I tucked it under one arm and looked around at the thrift store shelves and the faded rug. My mother ended her call and said cooperation would make everything smoother. My father held the door. Ethan said, "Enjoy the fresh air." I lifted the suitcase. Outside, the light had thinned to dull gold. On the sidewalk, the notice scratched my palm where the paper folded. Ordinary sounds kept moving while my life took a clean drop from an air on paper to a person without a bed. The word homeless is large, yet it can sit inside a breath. I counted 5 and found that I was still standing. I turned toward the only place that still felt like mine, my grandmother's house. I walked the blocks with the suitcase pulling at my arm. I felt the loss bloom and then settle into a hard, steady line. They had forced me out with a notice and a clock, but they had not taken my choices. I tightened my grip on the handle and kept walking. I was a millionaire on paper and a tenant without a bed in the same evening. The fall was sudden, but the ground under me felt real. It would not be warm and it would not be easy, but it would be mine. I dragged my suitcase down the quiet street until the gates of my grandmother's house came into view. The ironwork was familiar, yet tonight it felt heavier, almost like it was holding secrets I had not yet unlocked. My hands trembled as I slid the key into the lock. When the gate creaked open, a breeze carried the faint scent of cinnamon, a scent tied to every warm memory I had of her. The path to the front door glistened with dew, reflecting the soft silver light of the moon. I climbed the steps slowly, each one echoing against the silence of the neighborhood. The door yielded after a single turn of the knob, and I stepped inside. A wash of golden lamplight spilled across the hallway. The house was empty, yet it breathed with presence, as if she had never really left. The wooden floors groaned beneath my shoes. Every creak sounded like a whisper calling me deeper into the home. I dropped my suitcase near the entry and let my fingers glide over the old console table where she used to leave letters. The surface was smooth but faintly dusted, a reminder of her absence. Still, I could almost hear her humming as if she had just stepped into another room. I made my way to the kitchen where the faint aroma of cinnamon seemed strongest. My grandmother had always baked apple pies late at night. She said the smell of cinnamon calmed restless souls. I leaned against the counter, closing my eyes, and for a moment I could almost feel her beside me, rolling dough and smiling at my clumsy attempts to help. On the living room couch lay a folded quilt, the one she had made from scraps of old dresses and fabric remnants. I lifted it to my face, breathing in the faint scent of lavender mixed with aged cotton. The weight of it on my shoulders was both comfort and burden. It reminded me that she had stitched every piece by hand, telling me that dignity is stronger than wealth. I sat down and pulled the quilt tightly around me. My body shook, and the tears came without permission. They fell heavy, blurring the golden glow of the lamp. My sobs filled the still air, echoing through the empty house. I had held myself together all day, through the funeral, the will reading, and the cruel eviction. But here in the shelter of her walls, I finally collapsed. I cried for the years of being told I was never enough. I cried for the humiliation of being discarded by my own parents. I cried for the girl who had once believed that obedience would earn love. The sound of my grief rose and fell like waves crashing against rock. Eventually, exhaustion silenced me. My breaths grew shallow, and the tears left streaks across my face. I stared at the old photographs on the mantel. One showed my grandmother holding me as a child, her eyes proud, her smile unshaken. I reached out and traced the frame, whispering her name, as if she could hear me through the veil of death. But in the stillness, something shifted inside me. The sadness remained, but beneath it a small spark began to flicker. It was faint, but real. My grandmother had trusted me with everything, not because of chance, but because she believed I carried the values she cherished. If my parents wanted a battle, I could not meet them with weakness. I stood and walked upstairs to the bedroom she had always kept ready for me. The floor groaned, but it no longer frightened me. It sounded like the house was alive, encouraging me to keep walking. I set my suitcase by the bed and sat down on the edge of the mattress. As I looked around the room, I noticed a stack of legal envelopes on the dresser. They bore the handwriting of her attorney. My pulse quickened, but I did not open them yet. Instead, I pulled the quilt closer and whispered a promise to myself. If my parents wanted war, I would answer, but my weapon would not be bitterness or cruelty. My weapon would be the law. Justice would be my shield. And for the first time in years, I felt a measure of strength settle into my bones. I lay down with the quilt wrapped tightly around me. The scent of lavender and the faint creak of the house soothed my ragged heart. My eyes closed, and though fear still lingered, resolve burned brighter. They thought they had broken me, but they had only revealed what my grandmother had planted long ago. Tomorrow the fight would begin. Tonight, I allowed myself to rest in her legacy. The next morning arrived with a weight pressing down on my chest. I had barely slept, though the quilt gave me comfort. I woke to the sound of tires crunching on the gravel driveway. Through the upstairs window, I saw my parents and Ethan storming toward the front door. Their faces carried the same hunger I had seen at the will reading, only sharper, more ruthless. I hurried downstairs, my pulse pounding, expecting to face them alone. But when I opened the heavy oak door, two figures already stood inside the foyer. Alan Price, my grandmother's trusted attorney, stood tall with a folder in his hand. Beside him was Sarah Whitmore, a woman I had met only briefly at the funeral. Her sharp eyes and calm posture radiated confidence. My parents froze mid-step when they saw Alan and Sarah. For once, their rehearsed expressions of indignation faltered. Ethan whispered under his breath, though loud enough for me to catch, "Who are they?" Alan's voice cut through the silence. "Gregory, Linda, Ethan. I trust you slept well after throwing your daughter out into the night. Unfortunately for you, this house and everything inside it belong to Katherine, and you cannot simply take what was never yours." My mother's face flushed red. She stepped forward, pointing a manicured finger at me. "She is manipulating you. She doesn't know what to do with that kind of money. We are her family. We should handle it for her." Sarah spoke for the first time. Her tone was calm, but each word landed with precision. "Family? I have here a record of financial abuse spanning years. Credit card accounts opened in Katherine's name without her consent. Medical bills redirected into her credit history. Even her supposed student loans. Signed not by her, but by you, Linda." I felt my stomach tighten as Sarah laid the papers across the hall table. My parents stiffened, their eyes darting over the documents, but they said nothing. Ethan tried to scoff, though his voice cracked. "So what? Families share responsibilities. She benefited from those loans." Sarah didn't flinch. "Benefited?" Katherine paid interest on debts she never agreed to. She was forced into financial servitude while you siphoned resources for Ethan's lifestyle. I have proof of every transaction, and I am prepared to present it in court. My father's jaw tightened. He tried to recover his arrogance, but Alan opened his folder and revealed another set of documents. His voice lowered, deliberate. "Gregory, perhaps you should explain this instead. 6 months ago, you filed a petition declaring your mother-in-law mentally incompetent. You claimed she could not handle her estate. You attempted to gain conservatorship, to take control of her assets before her passing. Do you deny this?" For the first time in my life, I saw genuine fear flicker across my father's face. His lips parted, then closed again. My mother's eyes widened, darting toward him in disbelief. You never told me about this," Alan continued, unrelenting. "The court rejected your petition because the medical evaluations proved her to be fully capable, but the attempt remains documented. It paints a clear picture of intent. You weren't interested in caring for her. You wanted her estate long before her final will was read." I stood in silence, letting their shame unfold. The weight of years of manipulation shifted slightly off my shoulders. For once, I was not the one being cornered. Ethan tried to step in, desperation leaking into his words. "None of this matters. She is still our daughter. She can still choose to share. Katherine, please, just give us part of it. You don't have to drag us into court." The hypocrisy in his plea stung. I remembered him laughing the night before as I packed my belongings under my father's watchful eye. Now he played the role of a victim. I looked at him steadily, my voice firm though soft. "You kicked me out when I had nowhere else to go. You laughed at my pain. Don't speak to me of family now. Family does not steal. Family does not betray." My mother's hands trembled as she grabbed Ethan's arm. My father remained still, his face a mask of rage mixed with unease. Sarah closed the folder with finality. "We are prepared to proceed legally. Katherine will not stand alone. You may try intimidation, but it will no longer work. The truth is stronger than the lies you built for years." Alan placed a hand lightly on my shoulder. "Your grandmother trusted me to protect you. She also trusted Sarah. You are not alone, Katherine. She made sure of it." I felt the quilt of her love even without holding it. The alliances she had arranged became clear. She had foreseen their greed, their cruelty, and she had left me not only wealth, but guardians of justice. I straightened my back and met my parents' gaze without flinching. "This ends here. You will not break me again." For the first time, it was not me who trembled. It was them. Just as the tension seemed unbearable, the sound of the side gate creaking open startled everyone. Carlos, my grandmother's longtime caretaker, stepped into the foyer. His shoulders were stooped with age, but his presence carried quiet authority. In his hands, he held a small wooden box, polished but worn from years of use. Behind him came Dorothy, our neighbor of more than 3 decades. She clutched a thick folder against her chest, her face firm with resolve. My parents turned pale when they saw her, for Dorothy had witnessed too much over the years. Carlos placed the box on the hall table, gently pushing aside the papers Sarah had laid out. "Miss Katherine," he said softly, his accent warm, "your grandmother asked me to guard this. She told me there would come a day when you needed it more than anything." With trembling fingers, I opened the box. Inside lay a stack of journals. The handwriting, unmistakably, my grandmother's. I flipped through the pages, each filled with observations, dates, details, conversations, painstakingly recorded. She had written down every insult, every attempt my parents made to undermine me, every scheme to seize her wealth. My mother lunged forward, but Dorothy stepped in front of her. "Not this time, Linda. You won't silence the truth. I saw what you and Gregory did the night after the funeral. I have footage." She opened her folder and pulled out photographs taken from her home security cameras. The images were grainy, but clear enough. My father and Ethan sneaking into my grandmother's garage, carrying boxes and bags out to their car. Ethan's face drained of color. "That was ours," he stammered. "She would have wanted us to have those things." Dorothy's eyes narrowed. "She left explicit instructions that everything in that house belonged to Katherine. Stealing from your own daughter, from your mother-in-law, even before the funeral flowers had wilted. How low will you sink?" My father tried to recover his composure. "You have no legal standing. None of this matters." But then another voice rose from the doorway. A tall man with silver hair stepped into the room, his cane tapping against the floor. Robert Henderson, a retired judge who had been my grandmother's dear friend, adjusted his glasses and looked directly at my father. "It matters more than you realize, Gregory," he said firmly. "I oversaw the notarization of Margaret's will. I spoke with her personally. She was lucid, sharp, and absolutely aware of her decisions. I will testify to that in any court. My father's shoulders sagged as if struck. For the first time, the bravado drained from his eyes. My mother gripped his arm, whispering frantically, but no excuse came. I turned another page of the journal. My grandmother had even predicted this exact confrontation. Her words stared back at me. "They will come for you, Kate. But you will not stand alone. By the time they realize it, the circle of truth will already surround you." Tears blurred my vision, but for once they were not born of helplessness. They were tears of recognition, of knowing she had loved me enough to plan every step ahead, even after her passing. Alan cleared his throat. "What we have here is not just inheritance. It is a pattern of coercion, theft, and attempted fraud. With these journals, with Dorothy's footage, and with Judge Henderson's testimony, the case against you is overwhelming." My parents stood silent. Ethan shifted uncomfortably. His bravado shriveled to nothing. I raised my head, feeling the strength of all those who had come to stand by me. "You tried to convince me I was powerless. You tried to strip me of dignity, of home, of peace, but she left me something you will never understand. She left me allies, guardians, people who know the truth. You wanted a courtroom, but this house has already become one." Dorothy placed a hand gently on mine. "You are not alone, Katherine. She made sure of that." Carlos bowed his head slightly, as though passing a sacred torch. Judge Henderson stood firm like a sentinel of justice. Alan and Sarah flanked me, their support unwavering. And in that moment, I realized my grandmother had crafted not only a will, but a shield, a network of invisible allies who had now stepped into the light, transforming my family's greed into their own public trial. This was no longer just about money. It was about truth, finally breaking through years of silence. The air grew heavy, like the walls themselves were holding their breath. My parents stood across from me, their faces rigid with determination. My father's jaw clenched, his voice sharp enough to cut glass. "Katherine, this is your last chance. Sign over half of the estate or you lose your family forever." My mother's words followed, dripping with practiced anguish. "Do you really want to destroy us, Kate? After everything we sacrificed? After all the years we carried you? You owe us this. Without us, you are nothing." I let the silence stretch. My eyes moved from their faces to Ethan's, then to the allies who surrounded me. They had always demanded my obedience with threats of abandonment, and once I would have caved. But not now. Not after seeing the depth of their lies written in my grandmother's careful script. Finally, I spoke, my voice steady. "Number I will not sign. Not today, not ever." The refusal seemed to fracture the room. Ethan slammed his fist on the table, his anger loud but hollow. "You're pathetic. You think being a teacher makes you wise? You'll waste it all. That money should be in our hands, not yours." But for once, their words did not pierce me. For once, I felt the shift, the reversal of power. Alan stepped forward, his expression calm but resolute. "Katherine has made her choice, and as it happens, Margaret anticipated this exact moment." He lifted a small remote and pressed a button. The television in the corner flickered to life. My grandmother's face filled the screen, alive again in a way that made my heart ache. Her eyes shone with clarity as she looked directly into the camera. "Gregory, Linda, Ethan, you cannot claim ignorance. I kept records of everything you did. Every account you opened in Katherine's name. Every dollar you forced her to surrender. Every cruel word meant to crush her spirit." Her voice, steady and unwavering, filled the room like a judgment from beyond the grave. She listed moments I had buried. The day my parents drained my savings account to cover Ethan's tuition. The night they forced me to sign a loan document, threatening to cut off my food if I refused. The countless times they called me a burden. Each sentence struck like a hammer, smashing the false narrative they had tried to spin. My mother collapsed into a chair, tears streaking down her face. She pressed her hands against her cheeks, sobbing loudly. "It's not true," she wailed. "She never said those things. Margaret loved us all. She would never shame us like this." For a heartbeat, the display almost fooled me. But Dorothy's voice cut through the noise, firm and clear. "I was there, Linda. I stood in your kitchen when you told Katherine she was worthless. I heard you say Ethan was your only hope. You cannot rewrite the past in front of witnesses." The sobs faltered. My mother's hands lowered, revealing not grief, but fury, flashing in her eyes. Her performance had failed, stripped bare by someone who had no reason to lie. My father leaned heavily against the table, his knuckles white. His voice dropped to a growl. "You think this video changes anything? You think people will believe a dead woman over her living family?" Judge Henderson's cane tapped once against the floor. "They will believe evidence, they will believe corroboration, and they will believe Margaret because her voice carries more integrity in death than yours ever had in life." The silence that followed was not empty. It was charged, vibrating with the undeniable truth. For the first time in my life, I was not the powerless daughter sitting in judgment. I was the one holding judgment in my hands. I inhaled slowly, my grandmother's words still echoing. "You asked me to choose between money and family," I said. "But you were never a family. You were wardens of a prison you built from greed, and today those walls collapse." My father's lips curled in rage. My mother's shoulders shook with bitterness, not remorse. Ethan muttered curses under his breath, yet none of them could undo what had been revealed. The stage had turned against them, and they stood exposed, stripped of their illusions. Alan placed a hand on my shoulder. "This is the moment she prepared you for," he whispered. I looked once more at the frozen screen where my grandmother's face lingered, her eyes calm, her presence unwavering. And for the first time in years, I felt her beside me, not as a ghost of loss, but as the architect of justice. The room held its breath after the video faded. My father stared at the dark screen, then drew himself taller like posture could erase evidence. His voice came out rough but certain. "We did what we did to protect this family." "Protect," I asked. "By cutting your daughter down to keep your balance sheet clean. You called theft responsibility and control love. You drained my savings and forced signatures, then called it guidance. That was not protection. That was fear dressed as leadership." A nerve twitched along his jaw, and for a heartbeat the anger loosened. He looked at the floor, then at his hands, and the volume fell. "You do not understand," he said, softer than I had ever heard. He was the star. I learned that weakness gets ignored and softness gets used. If I did not take what I was owed, no one would give it. I swore I would never be small again. Pity pricked at me, unwelcome but honest. I kept my voice steady. "I understand wanting to never be small. I have been made small most of my life. The difference is that I do not make other people smaller to feel tall." The door inside him slammed shut. He straightened, anger washing back over the brief confession. "Do not turn this into a sermon," he snapped. "You are reckless. You think teaching qualifies you to manage an estate. We had to control you to keep the assets safe." Linda found her rhythm, arms crossed like armor. "Gregory is right," she said. "Appearances matter. Reputation buys security. Your grandmother indulged you, and now we pay the price for her sentiment." I let the quilt on the chair brush my arm and chose simple words. "I am not reckless. I am careful because I know what it costs to live with nothing. I know how to read contracts and how to refuse threats. Safety did not come from your reputation. It came from my work and from her planning." My father tried again, reaching for sorrow. "Families are messy," he said. "We made mistakes. Maybe we took too much control. Losing us will break you. You think these people will stay when the money dries up. They will not. Blood remains. Everyone else leaves." I kept my voice low. "Blood left when you sold my trust for comfort. The people here showed up without a check to cash. They are here because they knew her and they see me. That is choice, not transaction." He stepped forward, shoulders squared, and the apology curdled back into rage. "You think you are better than us?" he shouted. "You think a camera and a few notebooks rewrite a lifetime? Your grandmother was sentimental. She did not understand what it takes to hold power." Sarah's tone stayed cool. "What it takes is accountability," she said. He lifted a finger like a gavel. "Last chance, Katherine. Sign the transfer, and we keep this civil. Refuse, and we will scorch the earth." Fear skimmed my skin, then sank away. I had already lost the version of family you dangled like bait. I had already slept near homelessness and woken up standing. I stepped forward until the space between us belonged to my voice, alone. "Protect," you said. "Protect whom? Protect what?" "I will not sign. I will not shrink. You can light the match, but you will stand alone in the smoke." For a second, he faltered, searching for the obedient child he could still command. She was gone. The crack in our family finally showed on his face. Pride snapped the mask back into place, and he laughed, brittle and loud. "Have it your way," he said, "but do not pretend you chose honor. You chose sides." "Yes," I said. "I chose the side that does not steal from daughters and call it love." The house quieted, not empty but settled. My grandmother's plan held where their power ended, and in that quiet I recognized a rule that would carry me through the rest of the fight. People who cannot own their harm will rename it. Protection. I would no longer ever answer to their names for what they did. The heavy oak door closed behind them, and the silence that followed felt heavier than the shouting had ever been. My parents and brother left the estate in defeat, but I did not celebrate. I did not cheer. Their absence left me with a hollow ache that no inheritance could ever fill. I walked through the parlor, my footsteps echoing against the polished wood, and my breath slowed. It was over, at least the worst part of it. Yet, instead of triumph, what I felt was a strange sorrow. They had not only lost money, they had lost themselves. Years of greed, resentment, and control had carved away any trace of compassion they once carried. I stood by the mantel, fingers grazing the edge of a photograph of my grandmother holding me as a child. Her smile was warm, radiant, untouched by suspicion. Tears burned my eyes. I whispered to the still air, "They lost their way, Grandma, and I lost a family. But in losing them, I finally reclaimed my dignity." The thought circled me like a tide. $62 million now rested in my name. That figure held power, both promise and peril, and the question gnawed at me. Was I destined to become like them? Would I wake up one day, clutching control so tightly that I smothered love? The estate's quiet seemed to listen for my answer. I walked into the sitting room where her hand-stitched quilt rested on the back of a chair. I wrapped it around my shoulders, inhaling the faint scent of cinnamon and lavender that lingered in its fibers. The softness of the yarn pressed into my cheek, and in that texture I remembered her words. "Money is a tool. It is never the goal." Her voice, though gone, lived inside me. Money could build or destroy. It could heal or wound. And dignity, once surrendered for wealth, was nearly impossible to recover. I sat in the armchair where she had once read to me, my heart steadying. They had tried to make me believe I was powerless. They had tried to take away not only my inheritance, but also my sense of worth. Yet here I sat, not because of the money, but because my grandmother had seen the strength inside me long before I believed it myself. The night stretched around me, quiet and golden. Outside, the wind pressed against the glass, whispering of endings and beginnings. I thought of my father's fleeting confession, his shadow of pain, and how quickly pride had smothered it. My compassion had not died. I could still mourn the brokenness inside him, but I also understood I could not repair it for him. His choices were his own. When I closed my eyes, I saw not dollar signs, but classrooms, laughter, and freedom. The thought sparked softly, like the flame of a match. Maybe this inheritance was never meant to sit idly in accounts. Maybe it was meant to move through me, transforming pain into something greater. By dawn, I felt lighter, The war was done, but the real work lay ahead. Not revenge, not indulgence, but legacy. The quiet victory was not in defeating my family. It was in refusing to become them. The weeks that followed were filled with lawyers, signatures, and choices that stretched far beyond finances. Every day, I asked myself what my grandmother would do. Her wisdom became the compass guiding me away from greed and toward purpose. One morning, I visited the city courthouse and registered the Margaret Hayes Foundation, named in her honor. It was not a vanity project. It was a promise. The mission was clear: scholarships for students without financial support, financial literacy programs for women trapped in cycles of control, and community grants for survivors of abuse. The first classroom I funded was small, tucked inside a community center near downtown. The walls smelled faintly of paint and chalk. Old desks lined the room, and when the first group of women arrived, I felt my chest tighten. They looked like me in different seasons of life, some clutching empty checkbooks, some carrying tired eyes from years of being told they were burdens. I introduced myself not as an heiress, but as a teacher. My voice trembled only once before it steadied. I told them the truth, that I knew what it felt like to count every dollar at the grocery store, to be cut off from a phone plan by the people who claimed to love me, to be forced into debt I had not chosen. I told them I understood the shame of being silenced by money, and then I told them it did not have to end there. Each session, we shared skills my grandmother had whispered to me at the kitchen table: budgeting, savings, contracts, boundaries. But more than that, we shared stories, and in those stories, dignity returned. Laughter began to outnumber tears. One afternoon, as the class dismissed, a young woman named Maria stayed behind. She was barely 19, her hands trembling as she clutched a notebook filled with scribbled numbers. She walked up to me and hugged me with surprising strength. Her voice cracked as she whispered, "You gave me hope that I can get out of the dark." In that embrace, I felt my grandmother's presence as vividly as if she stood beside me. The quilt, the apple pies, the stories about dignity, everything she had given me was now flowing into the next generation. The $62 million were not chains to greed, but bricks for building freedom. Word spread. Within months, the foundation expanded to new cities. Volunteers came. Retired teachers, social workers, even lawyers who wanted to correct the abuses they once saw in silence. The work grew, and with it, my heart did too. Standing in a classroom filled with laughter and determination, I realized something profound. My family had tried to strip me of identity, yet their cruelty had given me the fire to create something lasting. They tried to reduce me to an heir, but I had become an advocate. The estate that once felt like a curse became the seed of legacy. And every time a woman signed her first savings account or a child received a scholarship in my grandmother's name, I whispered a quiet thank you. The foundation did not erase the scars, but it transformed them. I no longer lived as the daughter who was once called a burden. I lived as a woman who turned pain into purpose, and that was the inheritance my grandmother always meant for me to find. The morning carried the sharpness of autumn, the kind that made the air taste of endings and beginnings at once. I walked the quiet path of the cemetery, a bouquet of white chrysanthemums cradled in one arm and my grandmother's knitted quilt folded against my chest. The earth smelled damp from last night's rain, and golden leaves drifted slowly from the trees, spiraling before resting softly on the ground. My shoes crunched against gravel, and every sound seemed amplified by the silence. When I reached her grave, I knelt, laying the flowers carefully against the headstone. The granite was cool beneath my fingertips, its polished surface reflecting the pale sunlight that filtered through the trees. My breath clouded in the chill, but my heart felt strangely warm. I unfolded the quilt and draped it gently across the base of the marker, smoothing the edges as though she might come and wrap it around herself. I whispered into the still air, "Grandma, I kept my promise. I used the money to plant seeds, not to destroy. I tried to honor your lessons. Every single one." The wind stirred then, soft but certain, brushing against my shoulder like a hand I remembered too well. For a fleeting second, I felt as though she stood beside me, steadying me as she had countless times before. I closed my eyes, letting the sensations sink into my bones. Memories returned with startling clarity. Her laughter while teaching me to bake apple pies. Her steady voice as she said, "Dignity matters more than wealth." The rhythm of knitting needles, the click and slide, weaving warmth into every thread. Those moments had been the true inheritance, not the fortune written on paper. I sat back on the damp grass, not caring that the cold seeped into my coat. I thought of how far I had come, from a girl forced to surrender her savings, to a teacher scraping by, to a woman cast into the night by her own family. And yet, here I was, standing on my own, with dignity intact. The estate was secure, the foundation growing, but the truest victory was knowing I had not let bitterness consume me. The world had expected anger, revenge, or waste. Instead, I chose to build. That choice, I knew, would echo longer than any lawsuit or inheritance battle. It would ripple outward, reaching people I had not yet met, perhaps even children who had not yet been born. As the wind swirled, leaves lifted in the air and danced in a spiral. For one heartbeat, the cemetery no longer felt like a place of endings, but of continuations. I traced my fingers along her name carved in stone, whispering, "Thank you for believing in me when no one else did." I lingered until the sun rose higher, casting long shadows across the rows of graves. The world outside bustled with noise, but here all was still. Rising to my feet, I pressed my palm flat against the stone one last time. The coolness steadied me, and the quilt's soft scent of cinnamon and lavender clung to my skin. Walking away, I did not feel abandoned. I felt accompanied. The echo of her wisdom traveled with me, carried by the wind, by the rustling leaves, by the very breath I drew. That morning visit was not a goodbye, but a quiet affirmation. Her legacy lived on, stitched into my choices, alive in every step I took forward. The estate no longer felt like the cavernous home of silence it once was. By the time I returned that evening, it had transformed into something vibrant. Children ran through the halls, their laughter bouncing off the walls like music. Bright banners for the Margaret Hayes Foundation hung in the entryway, and the scent of crayons, paper, and fresh-baked cookies replaced the mustiness of unused rooms. I walked through the foyer, watching as volunteers carried supplies into classrooms that had once been guest suites. Chalk dust floated in the air, and the faint hum of voices carried a warmth that no inheritance alone could ever provide. The mansion was no longer a symbol of wealth. It was a sanctuary of second chances. In the main hall, a group of young students gathered around a whiteboard, practicing math problems. Their pencils tapped, their giggles rose, and the air thrummed with life. I leaned against the doorway, smiling. For the first time, the estate felt complete. Not because it was full of luxury, but because it was full of purpose. My eyes caught a familiar detail. The quilt lay folded neatly across a chair, its colors soft in the evening light. That simple fabric had carried me through grief, betrayal, and doubt, and now it sat among laughter and learning, a quiet witness to what legacy truly meant. I stepped outside to the garden, where the air was crisp with the scent of fallen leaves. A swing creaked gently as two children took turns pushing each other higher. Their laughter reminded me of nights when I thought joy would never return. Yet here it was, blossoming in ways I had never imagined. My voice rose softly, carrying into the twilight, though I knew no one else could hear the full weight of it. People say I inherited $62 million, but the real inheritance was something greater, the choice to keep dignity over greed. That is a treasure no one can steal. The thought lingered, wrapping around me like the quilt had earlier. It was not the money that defined me, but the refusal to let it corrupt me. And that refusal had bloomed into a legacy my grandmother would have been proud of. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and violet, I felt the story settle inside me. My family had walked away empty-handed, and yet I did not carry hate for them. Their choices belonged to them. Mine belonged to me. I turned back toward the mansion, where lights glowed warm against the gathering dusk. The future was unfolding, not in boardrooms or banks, but in classrooms filled with possibility. That was where healing lived, where hope grew, where dignity reclaimed its place. And as I listened to the final bursts of laughter echo through the halls, I realized the truth. The miracle had not knocked on my door with fanfare or fortune. It had waited quietly, patiently, until I was ready to open my heart. Before we say goodbye, we'd love to know, where are you watching from? Is it a quiet morning with a warm cup of coffee? Or a late night where stories like this keep you company? Let us know in the comments. We read everyone with gratitude, and if this story touched your heart, please consider subscribing to the channel. Not just to hear more stories like this, but to be part of a community that still believes in kindness, healing, and second chances. Thank you for spending your time with us today, wherever you are. We hope you carry this story with you, and remember, sometimes the miracle doesn't knock on your door. It waits quietly until you're ready to open your heart. Take care, and we'll see you in the next story.